Hey guys, here we are, chapter 14, section 2, urban land use. Today we're going to talk about how we use land in the urban areas where most people live. Your essential question: in what ways does urban sprawl affect the environment? Something to think about as we process through today's lesson. So, urbanization, just in general. This is the increasing ratio of the density of people that live in urban areas rather than rural areas. As we talked about before, basically from the 1950s on, in developed or the more developed countries, we have seen urbanization occur. Now in the second half of the 20th century, after the 50s, urbanization has slowed because it's already occurred. The people are already mainly here. Now, as these urban populations have grown, many small towns have actually grown together and forged large urban areas that we call metropolitan areas. Like Washington, D.C., we refer to it as the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. It goes from Washington, D.C. all the way to Baltimore. Here in Florida, we see it somewhere like from Miami to West Palm Beach. When you kind of drive between one another, it all just sort of blends together. It's really hard to tell where one town or city ends and the next city begins. This is just what we refer to, once again, as a metropolitan area. These towns have just grown and spread together. Now, urban areas that have grown slowly are often relatively pleasant places to live, in part because the roads and public transportation have been built to be able to handle the growth, and this allows traffic to flow freely. Here in Gainesville, the city of Gainesville has done a pretty good job of handling our growth. The city's projected well, they've tried to add the infrastructure, widen the roads, add new roads in, put in housing, etc. as the city's grown, and we've kept green spaces and parks and recreation things around, and they've done a pretty good job of it. But this is where, the buildings, the roads, parking lots get mixed in with all that stuff, and it winds up being a pretty nice place. We have built-in things trying to deal with rain runoff, all the technicals of water and piping that have to be done. We have enough hospitals and shopping centers and stores, and it winds up being aesthetic, pleasing to look at. Ooh, there's a nice area here. But anyway, when urbanization happens slowly enough, it tends to be pretty good. However, we're going to address something we call the urban crisis. This is when the population grows rapidly, too fast, and it basically overwhelms the infrastructure. This is where we get things like massive traffic jams. It's very difficult to get from here to there. The housing tends to be substandard. They've had to put housing in very quickly, and a lot of people are living in areas where they're kind of packed in on top of each other. The apartment buildings are just apartments with parking lot. There's no green space. Things have had to be put together very quickly because it grew faster than the planners were planning for. The air gets polluted, the water's not running, nothing's really working right because there's too many people on top of the infrastructure. Now, what do we mean by infrastructure? This is just the basic facilities of a county, region, city, town, whatever, such as the roads, bridges, sewers, railroads, shopping centers, etc. This is our infrastructure, the ability to get around and do what you need to do. Do we have the resources necessary for the people here? If infrastructure keeps up with population growth, things are okay. But when the population growth begins to exceed the infrastructure, this is where we run into the urban crisis, if you will. More people come in than it can really support, and the living conditions go down. And this has become so widespread around the world, we refer to it as the urban crisis. It means, you've moved into this area, the city, it's where the jobs are, but it's happened so quickly that we're really not in a good place. Everything's inadequate, things aren't working right, it's very difficult to try and get where we're going. You get the idea. Kind of the worst situation of living in an urban people with a whole bunch of people together. Another term that has been coined is the urban sprawl. This is the rapid spread of a city into the surrounding suburban, really rural area. So we have urban, and around the urban, we tend to call this suburban, suburbs. This is where many people choose to live. There's the city center with a lot of the jobs, but a lot of people live just outside of it in the suburbs. A little bit cheaper usually, and you can have a little bit larger home or space than living in the apartment, inside the apartment buildings in downtown. They tend to be more expensive because you're very close by to, the jobs, etc. Now, much of this growth is in this building of the suburbs. Urban area spreads into the suburbs, then out here we have our rural area, farms, woods, what have you. So a lot of the housing and associated commercial buildings border, once again, this kind of larger town. Unfortunately, a lot of these suburbs tend to get built on land that used to be farms. By and large, you have the urban area, and out here you had farms. Well, as the suburbs grow, farms are perfect spots to put a house. It's already kind of nice and flat, things are taken care of, it's easy to build on, and this is just a lot of times what we do. Somebody comes in as a developer and they offer the farmer a lot of money for the land, the farmer takes it, and then we build suburbs. People have somewhere to live, we get that, but we wind up losing valuable farmland, and then the farm moves out and we have to cut down a set of woods to create another farm, leading to deforestation. But each year the suburbs spread out over about another 1 million hectares, 2.5 million acres within the United States. So the suburbs are just continuing to expand and expand everywhere. Even here in Gainesville, out to the west of Gainesville, the suburbs have really been growing. In the 1960s, basically the very end of Gainesville was practically, let me make sure I get it, about 34th Street. Well, now there's neighborhoods all the way out to 43rd, there's neighborhoods out past 43rd, and basically neighborhoods go all the way out to 75 and even beyond now. Once again, this is just that urbanization, it's spreading out, or urban sprawl. A lot of times cities were actually built where there was very little room for expansion. So as the cities grew, then we start putting buildings and suburbs and houses out on really what we would refer to as marginal land. Land that was actually very poorly suited for building. Let me pick on New Orleans. I lived there for like 3 years. New Orleans proper, kind of around Jackson Square where you go into old New Orleans, that was up on an uprised area, and that's where the original town was built. And then New Orleans, really the city, is on in a little bit, and once again it's up on a high area. Well, this is where the cities originally were built, but then as it spread out in the suburbs and more people moved in, they began building on the flood plains. So when Katrina came through and the levees broke, everything was flooded out because this was really what we call marginal land. LA is another example. It's kind of small, but it's spread out and it's surrounded on mountains on 3 sides, and we start building up into the mountains. Mexico City is the same way, huge sprawl. But as we start going up, landslides are likely. Once again, it's not an area really designed for people to build on, but it's the only space and land left. So a lot of times these structures, houses, buildings, whatever they might be, are very difficult or sometimes even impossible to repair. Like if there are mudslides or there's an earthquake and it cracks, etc. And they wind up being also very difficult to insure or very expensive. You build there, so okay, you can build there, but your insurance is going to be super high. Just difficulties with it. Let's take a look at some other impacts of urbanization. So we talked about the urban crisis, there's just the urban sprawl, and as the sprawl spreads out, takes over farmland and sometimes goes into lands not really very good for putting a building on, but we do anyway. Well, the environmental conditions in the center of a city are often different than those in the surrounding countryside because the cities tend to both generate and trap heat. Black or dark colored things absorb energy and light colored things tend to reflect it. Well, out in the countryside, we have a lot of plants and greenery, and they tend to reflect a lot of the light. But inside the city, there's a lot of dark covered surfaces, Our asphalts, pavements, even roofs, etc., tend to be darker. So the city itself, we're generating heat. We have factories going, right? Cars driving around, heating our buildings, whatever it might be, and this tends to trap heat in. So it's a little bit warmer inside the city than it is just outside of it. Now it just may be a few degrees, but it's enough that it is really measurable, and we refer to this as a heat island. It's the area where the temperature is generally a little bit higher than the surrounding area. So cities tend to produce what we call heat islands, and all that infrastructure, the roads, building, the bridges, everything that makes it run, absorb the heat longer than the vegetation in the surrounding countryside do. We're beginning to realize that these heat islands actually affect local weather patterns. Hot air rises, right? So it's a little hotter over the city, so the air is rising. The air comes in from the surrounding countryside and rising up. Well, as it rises, it cools off and it causes rain. So a lot of times, like in Atlanta, Georgia is just one of them that we've identified, that there's increased rainfall as a side effect of this heat island. So urbanization and cities themselves can sometimes direct local weather patterns. Once again, very localized just around that area. But Atlanta itself tends to get more rain than the surrounding areas by it because of this heat island effect. Now the heat island effect can actually be modified by planting a lot of trees, even putting some trees up on roofs, replacing different things, having green spaces in. The more greenery you have in the city, the more it can help offset this heat island effect. Now, when we talk about urban areas, we have urban planning, right? Once again, I've mentioned in Gainesville, we do a pretty darn good job of our planning. We set aside things, we're gonna leave this as a park, that's gonna be green space, we're not gonna build there, we need to expand this, etc. So land planning, or land use planning is a vocabulary word. It's just a set of policies and activities related to the potential uses of land. In other words, we zone it. We say, okay, this is going to be some industrial area. We're going to zone this specifically for neighborhoods. We're going to zone this over here for shopping. You know, we try and set aside the land and plan out what is going to be where so people can get to all the various services that they actually need. Now, the federal government requires developers to prepare detailed reports assessing the environmental impact of many of their projects, and the public has the right to comment on these reports. So, you're a developer, you're going to turn this set of woods into a shopping mall, or you're going to turn this set of woods into a golf course, or you're going to turn this set of woods over here into suburbs, or you're going to turn this old farm into suburbs. Well, they have to set up a detailed set of the environmental impact, what it's going to do, take that before the city court, and you and I, the voters, have a right to go in and comment on these reports. And often, developers, city governments, local businesses, and even citizens like you and me disagree about these land use plans, which is why we have it set up. There are votes every time there's an election on environmental issues, and some of these are, do we want to have this thing? Do we want to protect these lands? Do we want to develop or build on these lands? And simply because there's all of this, back and forth, we try and plan out and map what we're doing. But a lot of times there just are disagreements between what we need to do and what we have to do. Now, land use planners, they do have some very sophisticated tools that are really available to them today. Because if you're going to put something out, you need to realize, well, do we have sewer lines running here? Do we have water piping into it already? What kind of infrastructure do we need to put into the area if we're going to have this many people, what have you? Now, one of the most important tools we have now, the 21st century, we have a lot of technological ability, but the GIS, the Geographical Information System, is one of our most powerful tools. It's a computerized system, and it kind of stores and we can manipulate viewing the geographic data. I kind of put a picture of one back here, but it's the kind of thing we can look at and you can put in different codes. You can say, okay, I only want to look at the sewer lines, and boom, you can only see the sewer lines. I want to look at the sewer lines and I want to look at the wetlands in the area, and you can see where they are. I just want to look at where all the telephone lines, right? Whatever. And you can either look at one or the other, or you can layer them all together and get an idea of what's already there, what do we need to build, what do we need to develop. But this GIS is one of our really outstanding tools to help us decide what to build where and what is going to have to be brought in, what kind of infrastructure does the city have to provide for us to be able to put in a neighborhood here, if you will. Now, anytime we talk about urban areas, right, anything, we have transportation, we've got to get around. We've got to get to our schools, we got to get to our jobs, we got to get to shopping centers, we want to get to the parks, we want to get to recreation, all of this stuff. Now, most cities in the United States are kind of difficult to travel around in without a car. It's just kind of after they were designed. Most of America was constructed after the invention of the automobile. The automobile came about in the early 1900s, and most of America was really developed after that. Some of our really old cities are a little smaller and it's not as easy to travel because it was designed to do it differently. But most of them have. So the availability of land in the United States was not an issue. So most of American cities sprawl over pretty large areas, as opposed to in Europe. Most of Europe was built before the advent of cars, and streets are narrower, everything's closer together, and people do a lot more walking in European cities, or they'll take public transportation, a bus, some sort of mass transit city. They take public all the time. We visited Austria and it was just that. You could walk to get almost anything you wanted to do, but if you wanted to go across town, you hopped on a bus. If you wanted to go from anywhere within Austria, you hopped on a train. They had trains interconnecting all the different cities, and it was very easy to get around with public transportation. It's not as easy to get around in America on public transportation. Some cities more than others, like New York or the really dense cities, mass transit systems are just constructed to try and get people where they want to go. Buses, trains, just like we talked about. They do save energy. They limit the loss of land. We don't have to use as much land if we're using it in roadways. We don't have to have as many parking lots. They reduce highway congestion. If more people are on a bus, then I can have 50 people on a bus instead of 50 cars. That's a lot smaller area. You don't have as much pollution. You don't have as much air or road pollution, right? There's not as many vehicles. One bus taking 50 people is a lot less pollution than 50 cars taking 50 people, or even 40 cars taking 50 people. But where the construction of mass transit isn't reasonable, carpooling is a really good idea. We need to look at ways that we can cut down. 2 to 3 people in a car is much better than everybody being in a singular car. Now, open spaces. We talked about our urban areas and all the infrastructure and people, and we're tied in, and transportation getting around. But every city needs open spaces. Somewhere where it's set aside, sometimes just for the scenic ability. Oh, it looks nice. Recreational enjoyment. It's important to be able to get out and kind of be in nature and get out and run around in the grass or in the trees and etc. There's a lot of environmental benefits as well, because all these open spaces, now this can include things like parks, public gardens, botanical gardens, biking trails, hiking trails, any of these things. Now typically what we refer to these as green belts. If it's really left in its natural condition, it's not just a really simply made garden, but things that are left in their natural state are green belts. And all these green belts that you find in a city, once again, Gainesville's done a really good job of this. These really provide economic services for us, right? They're producing oxygen, they're helping regulate the temperature, they're providing a place for us to go and relax. All of these things are really very important. The plants are taking carbon dioxide out of the air, which we're putting in by breathing in cars and everything running. They're also producing oxygen, which we need to breathe. They filter out pollutants. The more trees and grass and plants we can have in an area, the better it is pulling pollutants out from the air and even from the water. And it helps keep cities cooler in the summer. Remember this heat island effect. The more greenery we have around, those ecological services that they provide for us are really very important. These open spaces, especially with vegetation, also help our drainage problems. They'll absorb more rainwater. Anywhere where it's porous, right, like grass and ground, the water can get absorbed in. But all of our pavement, there's nowhere for the water to go and it runs off. Especially here in Florida, we want to make sure we have plenty of porous areas because we have an aquifer. We need the water to be able to recharge. So the less asphalt we have, it actually helps prevent flooding because it's not all running off and then overflowing. And the open spaces just provide urban dwellers with a lot of needed places just to go exercise and relax. A nice jogging trail, a place where we can take the dog out and go for a walk and get out in nature for just a little bit of time. But some of you guys, as you get into jobs and you become urban planners, make sure you keep in mind the green space. They're not just important for, ooh, it looks nice. They actually do a lot of things for all of us in the towns. Guys, that wraps it up for today, talking about the urban spaces. Come back next time and we'll look at how we manage all this different land. See ya.